we're not going to cheat you. So, this is the election of John F. Kennedy as President of the United States. It's an interesting election, and we'll start with the presidential election of 1960. It'll get a little bit more lengthy than some of the ones we've talked about before. The point I want to make right off the bat is this is going to be kind of a wide open election, similar to the election of 2018, because the incumbent president, Dwight Eisenhower, is going to be limited to service by the 22nd Amendment of the Constitution. So you're going to have a brand new group of Democrats and kind of a brand new group of Republicans that may show interest in 1960 to be president. The Democratic Party especially is going to show interest. You're going to have multiple candidates trying to get the Democratic nomination for president in 1960 from the Democratic Party, whereas Vice President Nixon is going to be kind of the front runner for the Republicans. I mean, he served 8 years as vice president. He's kind of expecting the nomination. More than likely would get the nomination if he wanted it. Probably won't face too much of a challenge. He will face some challenge, which we'll talk about. But it's the Democratic Party that's going to be wide open. It's just kind of, it's really pretty amazing. Now, I want to mention to you, when we start getting this more modern politics, that in 1960, the Democrats are going to get together in Los Angeles, California, and they're going to pick a candidate at the Democratic National Convention. The Republicans are going to get together in Chicago at the Republican National Convention, and they're going to pick a candidate, and we'll kind of explain to you how that works in a bit. But we want to start with the Democratic Party first and let you know that there were 5 very serious candidates for the Democratic nomination for president in 1960. It was a star-studded field because 4 of the 5 were sitting United States senators that were pretty popular around the country. So you got 5 people interested in the Democratic nomination for president when they get together in Los Angeles at the convention and try to pick one of them. 4 of the 5 were senators. We should get some of them. Obviously, which senator is going to be one of the ones interested? Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts. Okay, he's one of the hopefuls. Another one we've heard about, he gave a pretty interesting speech during the Democratic National Convention in 1948 saying that the Democratic Party ought to put out an effort in civil rights, which caused the Southern delegates to walk out. Remember that? Senator Hubert H. Humphrey of Minnesota. He's also a candidate in 1960, very popular senator from Minnesota. Okay, very popular senator from Minnesota. So you've got Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts. You've got Senator Hubert H. Humphrey of Minnesota. Then you've got the Senate Majority Leader interested in the presidency, and that would be Senator Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas. He's the Senate Majority Leader. He's got more political clout in the Senate than anyone else because he's the leader. Okay? So Senator Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas. The 4th senator kind of was riding a little bit the coattails of Harry S. Truman because they were from the same state of Missouri, and that was Stuart Symington. So there was some serious candidates in the election of 1960 on the Democratic side. 4 senators: Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, Senator Hubert H. Humphrey of Minnesota, Senator Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas, and Senator Stuart Symington of Missouri. Who was the 5th man that was in the picture? Come on. The other class didn't get her. I was a little disappointed. Who's this guy that's going to hang on again?
That one?
What's his...
He was a Family Guy, huh?
Adlai Stevenson, the 2-time loser to Eisenhower, is a serious contender. The Democrats would not be overly disappointed if he got the nomination. So Adlai Stevenson, who had run unsuccessfully in 1952 and 1956 against Eisenhower, is in the picture in 1960 as well. Well, when you put these 5 guys together, you always have 2 that are kind of the front runners. And the 2 front runners, the ones that people thought probably would gain the nomination, were Senator Kennedy of Massachusetts and Senator Humphrey of Minnesota. They were considered kind of the front runners. Okay? They were considered the front runners. But both had issues to overcome. If they were going to get the Democratic Party nomination, they were going to have to overcome some issues. Now, Humphrey had one issue that he had to overcome if he was going to convince fellow Democrats to nominate him for president, whereas Kennedy had 2 issues he would have to overcome to gain the support of his party for nomination. Humphrey's issue is he was viewed as too liberal, ironically in today's world. He was viewed as too liberal for the Democrats. Well, how do we view Democrats today? Every one of them's a libtard. That's what you hear them say, libtards, liberal. That's what people say. I'm not saying, I'm just saying the Democrats are viewed as very liberal. Well, at this point in history, the Democrats were concerned that Humphrey might be too liberal for them. Okay, that's one thing he had to kind of prove to people if he was going to get the nomination. Kennedy had two problems he had to overcome. Anybody know what they were? His religion, number one. Because the feeling was, if he won the nomination for presidency and then won the presidency, that the Pope would be running the country. The Catholics had run the country. Now I'm telling you something, this came up when Mitt Romney ran for president a couple of elections ago. There were people, I heard people say, by God, if he wins the presidency, the Mormon Church is going to be running the country. I heard it, and I just smiled because I thought, that's the same type of thing that Kennedy heard about the Catholics way back in 1960. What else did he have to overcome? What other issue?
His age.
His age, yeah. He was considered young, 43. No man had ever been elected president that young. Only Theodore Roosevelt had been president, and he assumed the presidency after the assassination of William McKinley. So no one had been that young and been elected, okay? And when you think of youth, you think of inexperience. One of his harshest critics, Kennedy's harshest critics during this process, was Harry Truman, who believed that Kennedy was too young, that shouldn't even believe that he should have a shot at the presidency because he didn't have enough experience. He spoke openly against Kennedy during this process, okay? So that's kind of how it went. Well, let me explain. I've probably done this before, but I got to do it again for my own thought process. So, the 1960 Democratic National Convention happens in Los Angeles. All these people come into this area, okay, into this forum. And what happens is each state in the Union sends a certain number of delegates based on population, okay? Now, if I'm a delegate, and I'll just tell you the story, about 30 years ago I was pretty active in Democratic politics in Montana, and I was an alternate delegate. In other words, if the delegates were chosen, if one wouldn't have been able to go, I would have been able to go to the Democratic National Convention. And I would have had a vote. I could have voted for whoever I wanted to get the Democratic nomination. It's not all or one. I had my own vote, and I could vote for whoever I wanted. So these delegates get together. In this particular election, you had to have 761 delegate votes to win the nomination, which was 2/3 majority. So it tells you there was in excess of 1,000 delegates there, right? But you had to have 761 delegates give your vote to get the nomination. Now, let me tell you how this process works, because it's very important you understand this. So they get there and they campaign, and they have fun, they party, and they do all these things, and they politic, and they campaign, and pretty soon we get to the roll call vote. And we have a first ballot, and they go alphabetical order by state. So this is what you might hear, okay? Alabama, the great state of Alabama, home of the 2018 national champion Crimson Tide football team, give their 28 delegate votes to the next president of the United States, Alexa Caballero. Okay, that's a roll call. Now, they could have said the great state of Alabama gives 20 votes to Alexa Caballero and 8 votes to Nick Lawton. They can split them any way they want, but you got to get 761. Now, they go all the way down the states in alphabetical order. If no one would get the 761 by the end, then it would go to a second ballot, and all the votes from the first ballot start over. So Alabama might give those 28 28 delegate votes that they gave to Alexa the first ballot, they may give them to Rhiannon the second, because people are politicking, okay? Well, anyway, in this particular election at the Democratic National Convention, they start the roll call. Finally, a state gives their 23 delegate votes to Kennedy, which gives him the 761 to be nominated. Guess who that state was? Wyoming. Wyoming. In other words, now I want you to think about this, because it kind of gives me a little goosebump feeling. Historians will tell you that if Wyoming did not come through with the votes to get Kennedy the nomination, there was a good chance that he would not have received the nomination on the second ballot, because Lyndon Johnson was making a run, Adlai Stevenson was making a run, And we wouldn't be talking about a presidential assassination or the Cuban Missile Crisis or maybe any of these things if Wyoming doesn't give those 23 delegate votes. They were the last state. If they don't do it, it's going to a second ballot, and historians state that there was a good chance Kennedy would have never been nominated on a second ballot. Okay, so there's a little small history for you. So, for the Democrats, they have chosen Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts to be their presidential candidate. They then choose Senator Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas to be his vice presidential running mate. So for the Democrats, you're going to have a Kennedy-Johnson ticket. Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts for president, Senator Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas for vice president. Why would they pick Lyndon? They were the polar opposites, really. I think being Senate Majority Leader didn't hurt, but they wanted someone from the South. Okay? They wanted to balance the ticket. I will just tell you as a prelude to our lecture later down the line that Lyndon Johnson's most miserable years were the years he spent as vice president or what he considered a less experienced man. Okay? The vice presidency's like falling off the face of the earth. But they did it to balance the ticket because the Democrats knew they would have to win the South. Okay? So, there's the Democratic situation. Well, before we even get to the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Nixon already has a problem because he is facing a challenge that he didn't think he was going to face. And the challenge was coming from that fellow up there in that blue frame, Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller of New York. He is somewhat challenging Nixon for this Republican nomination, and Nixon's not happy about it because he's the vice president. He thinks he should get it. Now, Nelson A. Rockefeller is the New York governor, as I mentioned, and he's a very wealthy liberal. And he served 2 successful terms, he being Nixon. Nixon served 2 successful terms as vice president and didn't believe Rockefeller should even be challenging him. What are you doing here? Why would Rockefeller be challenging him? What would be the reason that he would make it appear that he was interested in the nomination?
See if Nixon's serious?
What's that?
To see if Nixon was serious.
Oh no, Nixon, that's a good guess, but Nixon was real serious. That he thought he was the anointed one, so to speak.
Was he against civil rights?
You're getting closer. Rockefeller didn't agree with Nixon concerning what Nixon wanted for the Republican platform at the convention, because what you put together is a platform at the convention on what you're running on. If we're elected, this is what we'll do. If we're elected, this is what we'll do. Well, Rockefeller didn't agree with what Nixon thought should be on the platform, and so he decided to challenge it. So, what might be the first, what would be the thing you'd do? Because if you're not in agreements, if this continues to fester, so to speak, what party does that help?
Democrat.
The Democrats. So if you're Nixon, what might you do at this point?
Team up with him.
Very good. But to do that, what would you have to do? You might be the MVP today. He decides that he better meet with Rockefeller. And he's even going to put his ego on the back burner and go to Rockefeller's turf in New York rather than say, well, I'm the vice president, you come to me. He called up Rockefeller and said, I think we need to meet for the betterment of the party. I'll even come to New York and we'll sit down and talk. And when Nixon sat down and talked with him, he had 2 goals to accomplish. What were those 2 goals? Lily kind of alluded to one of them. What did you say? No, after that. You said they'd have a meeting, but then you said something before that. Did you say something like team up with
join
it?
up together.
What did Nixon want Rockefeller to be?
Vice president.
His vice presidential running mate. So that was one goal that Nixon hoped to accomplish in this meeting, was to convince Nelson Rockefeller to be his running mate. Would that be a good choice? I mean, he was pretty popular, wealthy, you know, balance the ticket. What would be the second goal, obviously, that he wants to get taken care of in that meeting? Is a compromise on what? On the platform. Yeah, he wants to get a compromise on the platform. So Nixon goes to New York with 2 goals in mind when he meets with Rockefeller. 1, to try to get a compromise on the Republican Party platform, so they agreed. And number 2, to try to get Rockefeller to join him and run as his running mate in this election. Well, Rachel, he accomplishes one of the 2. Which one? compromise. He really does not want to run. And so after they work out this compromise, they go to the Republican National Convention in Chicago, and Nixon wins easily on the first ballot. Doesn't have to go all the way to Wyoming. He wins easily on that ballot. So he's going to be the presidential candidate for the Republican Party in 1960. And then the Republicans then choose Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. to be his running mate. Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. to be his running mate. So in this particular election so far, you've got John F. Kennedy as the Democratic presidential candidate. You've got Lyndon B. Johnson as the Democratic vice presidential candidate. You've got Richard Nixon as the Republican presidential candidate. And you've got Henry Cabot Lodge as the Republican vice presidential candidate. But we're going to get a third party. The independent party is going to come in. And they're going to nominate this fellow right here. Whoops. Senator Harry F. Byrd of Virginia. Oh. And guess who's going to run with him? A familiar name. J. Strom Thurmond. Where have we heard about him? He ran in the States' Rights Party, didn't he, in 1948, remember? And what was he at that time? He was a governor. You know what he is now? Senator. And he will serve in the Senate from this point on longer than any man in American history. So Harry F. Byrd, Senator from Virginia, will be the independent party candidate for president, and his running mate will be Senator J. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. Okay, so the parties are set, right? And we'll get a little bit of a start on the next subtopic, which is the campaign begins and the great debates. Campaign begins and the great debates. Now, as this 1960 presidential campaign begins, we're going to see two interesting scenarios that had never ever occurred before in a presidential election campaign. Two new things, never happened before. Okay, so the 1960 presidential campaign will provide two very interesting scenarios that had not occurred before in presidential elections. Number one is, for the first time ever, a presidential candidate promised to visit all 50 states during the campaign. No one had ever done that before. Not only had they not promised, no candidate had ever visited all 50 states, because what states do they concentrate on? The big ones. Which candidate said he'd visit all 50? Kennedy or Nixon? Nixon. Nixon. Richard Nixon promised he'd visit all 50 states during the campaign. We'll see if he does later. What else would be the first time that ever happened during a presidential campaign? Television, that a girl, television. This will be the first time a presidential campaign is fought on television. Now I'm going to give you a few statistics about television, then we're going to quit. Anybody know what year the first television came out? 1945. It had a screen about this big, and it had a cabinet about this big. I mean, it was a little tiny screen in a big cabinet. It was more furniture than anything. But it came out in 45. The point I want to make is within 5 years, by 1950, they estimated that 4 million Americans had the luxury of TV in their homes. About 4 million people had televisions in 1950. Now, we're talking about 1960, are we not? And to give you an impact, or an idea of the impact of television on this political campaign, in the next 10 years, from 1950 to 1960, the number of televisions people owned in America went from 4 million to 44 million. So 40 million more people had television sets in 1960 to 1950. So with 44 million people enjoying the luxury of television, this will be the first presidential election ever fought on TV. Okay, now, I'll end it with this. This is how bad we are. Anybody know what a Hutterite or a Mennonite or an Amish person is? They kind of have their own communities and their own religions. Well, my wife taught at a Hutterite college. And the kids never, ever hardly got to come into town. That was like a big deal. So she invited the kids in from her class in to visit us one day. And so they came in and one little boy says, "Hey Randy, will you give me a tour of your house?" Okay. So I take him in. This is the living room. "Oh, geez, Randy, you got a TV in here." He says, "You know, we don't get TVs. We don't have TVs." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." So I said, "Well, this is the kitchen." "Oh, you got a TV in here too." Well, I took him into the den. "Oh, got a TV in there too." Took him in the bedroom, showed him the bedroom. Extra bedroom. "Oh, TV there. TV in the regular bedroom. TV downstairs." I'm thinking, this poor kid never had a TV in his life, and I got like 9. Right? How spoiled are we? And I'm thinking to myself, why do I need 9 TVs or whatever? And this poor guy never had a 1. So when I talk about the luxury of television in the 1960s, not everybody had 7 like we do now. Very few people had 1. Okay? So keep that in mind. But by 1960, a lot more people had televisions than they did in 1950. And it's going to lead to television war in this particular campaign. All right, kiddos, that's where we'll continue on. Don't forget your biography paragraphs have to be in blue ink, and they're due tomorrow by 3:30.